We spent a lot of time talking about North America, focused on Wisconsin. These are some patterns that are observed in even broader geographic areas. There are different ways to take this approach to try and kind of classify communities across the world. This is one way to look at it. So this is describing what's known as floristic realms. Realms, sometimes we talk about realms or kingdoms, these very broad areas that are basically what it's showing are these areas with the same color would be areas that have more of the same kinds of species. So not necessarily one species distributed through there, but maybe broader patterns of a genus or even a plant family that are distributed in these areas. And same methods as before, you basically tally up all the different kinds of plants that you can find in these areas and try to draw a boundary that says this is where one area stops and the next one takes over. And what we can maybe guess at here, the climatic regions for these. So in the Americas, pretty clean difference here. This is about where the line of the tropics starts. In the continental area here, in between Texas about here and northern Mexico, this is a lot of desert. So what we see are differences in climate, but also potentially some of these barriers that are hard to cross. So if plant species ancestrally were going to get into these different areas, sometimes they had to make it past a barrier, and that could be limiting for some species. So I think that's a good way to think about these. Is they're areas that are separated from each other. They might have similar climates, but they were areas that a single plant species would have a hard time getting from one into the other. So we've got deserts separating the Arctic or the Northern American habitat from the Southern American habitat. This split between the United States and Mexico, this is one of the reasons why that Flora of North America project stops north of Mexico, because there'd be a whole lot of these more southern species you'd pick up still in Mexico. This is all Mexico still. You could pick up new species that are very diverse and rather different from the rest of North America here. So it's kind of a natural cutoff. Moving over to Eurasia. This one, I've changed the names here a little bit from what you might see otherwise, but I'm going to try to enforce these names here. So Afro-Eurasian, a rather big swath of territory here from Northern Africa all the way through much of Eurasia. We've got the Sahara Desert in this area, the Arabian Peninsula, very dry. So this boundary is a good boundary for keeping plants from dispersing across those areas. So the desert is included in that one, but that would be, by and large, not a lot of species in the desert itself. Northern Africa has a very similar pattern to Southern Europe. And so this is kind of a Mediterranean habitat. Over here, we've got the Himalayan mountain range and Gobi Desert in this area. So deserts and mountains, kind of insurmountable, difficult places to get past. And then southeastern Asia heading into Australia. It's kind of a line, the natural line here, difficult to disperse across those islands. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 of these. 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. 6 floristic realms. And again, if you were studying plants in one group, you'd find a lot of the same species in the Afro-tropical region that are different from Afro-Eurasian and so on. These can be subdivided, so I'm going to focus just on North America again, but what I've got here are the same basic colorings that we had in the previous slide, subdivided in different lightness and darkness by the subdivisions within those. So these are what's known as major habitat types from the same resource. So the boreal, far northern habitat type, the temperate broadleaf, we've seen these before, temperate grassland, that's the prairie. And then temperate coniferous, a little bit different from boreal. Coniferous in the southeastern United States, as well as the northwestern United States. Not necessarily the same kinds of, the same plant species exactly, but the same general kind of habitat. And then a little bit desert here as well. So the western desert past the Rocky Mountains, west of the Rockies, getting into that desert I was describing between Texas and central Mexico. And then just one more of the same thing, now highlighting the similarities of habitats across. So I think this is kind of helpful to think about, that you have a very similar kind of climatic, adaptive habitat type in some of these places that are separate from each other. So for example, the boreal, the far northern of North America, has a lot of similarities to the far northern of Eurasia, but they're in different floristic realms because we've got this Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, difficult areas for plant species to cross. You have very similar habitat types, but a different group of species here and here. Nonetheless, lots of related species in those areas. So between the United States and Eurasia, that's where we have probably the most similarity. And then other parts of the world, South America and Central Africa, also some similarities. And so you see potentially some species that have distributions that kind of cover those two different areas that are similar. So you can go even farther back in time. So we talked about glaciation. If you go really far back in time, you can get to millions of years in the past. So the glaciers we think of as tens of thousands of years in the past. And farther back, we get into the area where we talk about continents moving around. So I'll see a slide on that. But I'm highlighting here, I like this study a lot. This is from a paper that was investigating species and genera that are found in rather different parts of the world. And so a little bit tricky to orient yourself to the map, but what we're looking at, we're actually looking at the Earth from the south. So this is Antarctica here, Australia, the south of South America, Southeast Asia over here, and this is the south of Africa. Kind of focusing here on the abilities of plants to move between these areas at a time when the southern continents were a little bit closer joined, potentially. So we have distributions here, I've got them on here. F, this group that I've highlighted in this color, they have a common ancestor kind of in this area. D, Southern Africa and Southwestern Australia. And if you got this pattern, at some point you got to kind of infer that plant species were able to move between those areas. So was it difficult to move between them? That becomes an open question. So how do plant species move between these different areas? Well, one reconstruction that we have is the idea that obviously the continents were not always in the positions where they are today. So we can see them moving around in these reconstructions through time. This one's heading towards the present. So lots of joined land masses. So if you match up with the, stop this at one point, match up the movement of the map with the distributions of these different species, you can see there was a time in between the origin of land plants, the origin of seed plants, when some of these climatic areas were pretty close together. So maybe I'll stop this at some more informative times. All right, so here we got 420 million years ago. I can't quite tell everything. Looks like this is some North America and some Eurasia there, all pretty close together. So these continents being closely joined together, this was a time when plant species could move around. This is also the time before there were seed plants evolved. So if you go far enough back, they're similar continents and also much simpler plants, I suppose you could say. Okay, so around here, we got the continents even closer together. This is on the scale of the whole planet, not too far distance between all these different continents. And this is about the origin of seed plants based on reconstructions, getting up to the origin of the land plants. So about here, the origin of land, flowering plants, I should have said. So the origin of the flowering plants, pretty easy to move between. And the previous slide was showing a plant family that's got a rather ancient origin. So some of those movements we saw between Australia and Africa There were times when those were not super far apart. So here's Africa coming in here. There was a time when Africa was nestled in with South America. And then here's Australia over here. And there were times when Antarctica was actually a home to a decent number of warm habitat species. All right, been talking through this a lot. Let's see if we can play this out a little bit more. So here we've got Pangea, getting a little more familiar with our continent types as they look today. So Eurasia here, North America, South America, Africa. So let's see, 125 million years ago on our map here, we're about halfway through the diversification of the flowering plants. This is like the origin of the flowering plants here. So as the diversity of flowering plant groups was getting established, these continents were pretty close together. Oh no, sorry, we're gonna have to jump ahead here. Even more. All right, maybe I'll just let this play out. So in the last 100 million years, this is when the continents have really split apart. You see India flying over here to establish the Himalayas, basically the result of India smashing into Eurasia. And there we are today. So for a lot of that time, the continents were not terribly far apart. We saw there was a phylogeny on the last one that had dates on it. We talked about making phylogenies a little bit. We'll get a lab where you get to make your own phylogeny. And a lot of times these phylogenies have a time scale at the bottom here. So the time scale is, it's an estimate, and there are certainly a lot of, there's a lot of uncertainty about that estimate, but it's kind of our best guess moving forward, keeps getting updated as we have more evidence. And it's based on the amount of difference that the DNA has accumulated over that time. So that's one component of dating, is that species that are more distantly related have more different DNA. If you assume a basic, they call it a molecular clock. If you assume that the DNA is kind of changing at a steady pace, at least over millions of years, then you can get these longer branches, longer lines on here for periods of time when the DNA had more change. So we can get a lot of this information just from the DNA. The other part of that is really putting the number on it. And that's where all these arrows come in, where these arrows are fossils. And so the fossils are identified as unambiguous, so clear examples of living plant groups. And the thinking is basically, if you have a plant that you can identify as belonging to a family or an order or a genus, and you didn't have a reason to expect that family before a certain, the ancestor didn't have this feature that's characteristic of the family, then you would say, okay, we have at least an earliest date, kind of a oldest date when that family, or a youngest date, I should say, this kind of calibration point where that family would have existed. So all along here are fossils that were identified as belonging to one group or another, and those fossils have dates. So we have another independent way of dating how old a fossil is. That has to do with the dates of the rocks that they're in and so on. And so that information together is put together to get this complete view of how long ago any one of these things happened. So you can kind of calibrate your phylogeny at a few places and use that calibration to infer other events. So for example, we have this group of species here that don't have calibration points listed, that we can still kind of match them up with the calibration of the other branches to kind of figure out when that happened. So how do you date your phylogeny? You find your plants, fossils, match them with parts of the tree, and figure out when that came around. And I always like to point out here, if you remember the original Jurassic Park, there was this character, Dr. Ellie Sattler, who her job was paleobotanist. So if you ever want to get into studying botany of fossils, fossil plants, maybe someday you will get recruited by an insane billionaire to help him set up his park. She also had the unpleasant job of sifting through the poop, but she did not shy away from that job. And it was an important lesson to learn about what the dinosaurs are eating. Anyway, I'd say most paleobotanists are not sifting through anybody's poop. They're just looking at fossils. Okay, so we've seen this example before as an example of ecology heading into new ecological territory. Matching this up with geological events are important. And so in the topic of biogeography, phytogeography, we find out where these plant species are, where they came from, and kind of how they got into that habitat. So there's a new habitat made available by the origin of the Andes mountain range, and the plant species that could fill that habitat were ones that were in the area. That would be the most natural kinds of plants to take over that habitat. Maybe they were occupying similar habitats in nearby areas and having some of the adaptations that would help them in these high altitude or cloud forest environments allowed them to jump into that space and fill it. Them more likely than, say, a plant from Africa that might be well adapted as well, just couldn't get there as easily. So a lot of this is just finding ways to explain why we find certain plant species in certain areas. Okay, so we saw some examples of continents moving around, and it's not always super ancient, these movement patterns. So this is from a study that was investigating aquatic plants. And these are pairs of aquatic plants that are found in different areas, and their average time to their common ancestor, meaning that to be in these different areas, their ancestor would have had to disperse from one to another of these places. So these are areas as defined by the different shadings, and between any two areas, for example, between Madagascar and India, this is the average time of dispersal between those places. So 15.8 million years, 8.6 million years. And if you remember from the plate tectonics video, 8.6 million years ago was hardly different from how the continents look today. So there was still an ocean here. There's still an Atlantic Ocean separating South America and Africa. And these species had an average time in the past of dispersing across that ocean 8.6 million years ago. Some more recent, some more ancient. But in relatively recent time, within the last 10 million years, somebody was able to make it across the ocean as a plant. And for me, this is really surprising. I still have to kind of accept that the numbers are right, but and I think it matters that you can kind of think in terms of millions of years. So given 4 million years of time, at some point, somebody made it from to or from South America, Eastern Eurasia. And how do you suppose they got there? Well, it turns out there's a lot of movement across these islands, or I'm sorry, across these oceans. So animals are involved, drifting plant material is involved. Rare but impactful events can happen, hurricanes, sandstorms. So little bits of plant can get moved across ocean. And if you try enough over 4 million years, eventually some of these can actually move across. So sometimes it's a little more obvious. You can envision an animal flying across an ocean. We have migratory animals that move quite a distance. Other times you might have to kind of figure out exactly how that happened. But I think for myself, I've come around to feeling like, well, it's possible. And I'm willing to believe it. I'm willing to believe that these long distance dispersal events happened. Be great to have a little more information about it, but maybe someday, maybe we just have to take some faith in what can happen over 1 million years. And then we have kind of bringing this around to where plant species are found today. We have some plants that have been moved around by people. So all the patterns we've seen up to this point, I've been talking about patterns that are natural, as in not involving humans. But humans, ever since we've had the ability to move around as a species, we've brought plants with us. So the human species ancestrally moving out of Africa into Eurasia, and so on. All the places people went, they probably brought plants with them. And in more recent years, in the last 300 years or so, last 500 years, people have been moving plants across oceans as we have this technology of seafaring. So people exploring different continents, brought some plants with them on purpose, some accidentally. And so these days we have a designation of plants being native or non-native to an area. And in North America, we basically have this non-native designation if we don't have evidence of a plant species being in North America before around the time of Christopher Columbus sailing across the Atlantic. Some people extend it farther back. There's evidence that Vikings made it to North America in like the 800s. So if you can figure that the plants were growing naturally before any European humans arrived, that makes it a native species. If you have evidence that humans brought some of these plants with them, those become non-native. And among the non-native species, some of them are what we call invasive, meaning that they're not native, but they're also kind of problematic for the native species. So on here, we've got a couple of native species, cranberries, and this Rexia plant again. We've got a non-native plant in the center. This is chicory, non-native, but not terribly troublesome. So this one is not really invasive. And then on the right, this one is a notorious invasive plant, garlic mustard. And invasive meaning that it has a negative impact on native species. So we'll talk about these a little bit more as we go. Plants that are kind of on people's watch list. We'll also look at the ability to determine plants being native or non-native. We're going to leave it there for this topic. Thanks for listening.